All right, so it's 1 minute past the hour, and we are so delighted to welcome Joanne Hill back for the second time. And I believe, Dr. Morgan, this is your third time speaking to the group, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, I did
Uh,
not know that.
so this is the Finance and Financial Planning and Analysis Strategic Planning Group, Scott Connor and Marie Gaffney's two teams. So it includes people from payroll, accounts payable, finance, budgeting, strategic planning, that whole group. And we're very happy to have you come and speak to us on this Friday afternoon. I thank you very much. Just to let everyone know, we will have 4 polling questions. In order to get CPE, you will need to answer 3 of those 4 and be connected for 50 minutes. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm so glad to be here. It's Friday. I like to say Fabulous Friday, which means we get the weekend or we're one day closer to Monday. So Dr. Morgan and I were asked to come because today is still part of Black History Month, which officially ends on Monday. I hope you understand my heart when I say this, that I long for the day when we really would not have to have Black History Month or Women's History Month or Native American Month, because as we all know, Black history is being made every day. So is women's history and everything. But since we're here, I want to talk a little bit about Black History Month from the perspective of diversity and inclusion, and then that'll segue into Dr. Morgan, who's going to continue that conversation, but around healthcare. So next slide. You see our slides are on the new brand. One of the things I say often, it is time to get back to basics, and our greatest asset is our people. Unless we're totally not aware, and I think we all are, we are in the midst of a great resignation, not only at Piedmont, but in organizations across the United States where people are deciding, do I want to work there? Do I not? And because of that, in everything that we do, with our patient-centered care, with COVID and integration, and I gave a similar presentation to the Piedmont board, I believe we can never forget that our greatest asset is our people. The founder of AFLAC said, if you take care of your people, the people will take care of the business. So how are we going to take care of them? Next slide, from a point of diversity, equity, and inclusion. When I joined almost 3 years ago, the mantra was making D&I part of our DNA. What does that mean? It means it just becomes who you are. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to consider it. If you're planning an event, you think about doing something that's inclusive for all. If you're serving food, you think about the fact that people are different. It is who you are. I once heard someone say, well, I always teach my children to be color blind because I don't see color. My response to that is we should teach our children and we should behave in an area where we're color bold. I mean, the only person I can see right now on the Zoom is me. It is obvious that I am an African American female. So you can't say you don't see my color, but I ask you to be bold, even in this conversation, to look beyond that for me, for Dr. Morgan, and for whatever everybody else has, and to settle in on how together we can make D&I part of our DNA. Next slide. So how are we doing that? That's a great question. I'm so glad you asked. When people ask me about diversity and inclusion at Piedmont, I tell them we are working on 4 things. The focus is 4 things only. And people say, well, didn't we have those same priorities in FY21? We did. And we still do because we haven't mastered them. And part of the conversation, again, is increased minority representation and leadership. And why is that? Because you move what you measure. If we look across all of our growing number of hospitals, when you look at the C-suite, do we see more women? Do we see more ethnically diverse people? And so hence, we develop a goal that for every position, director and above, we would have a diverse slate, which means one person is diverse. They could be a veteran. They could be part of the LGBTQ community. They could be a woman. They could be ethnically diverse. But I want to pause right here to say, we want to always hire the best person. But if we never change who's coming to the table, then we're never going to be able to move up to truly have that innovation in the things that we need to have. So our goal was to have 93%, and right now we are at 100% slate. So we're getting people there. Increase access to education and training. So when people talk about diversity again and inclusion, they always seem to go to age, sex, gender, sexual orientation, identification. But I would like to say to this group, how many people on this call were born outside of the United States? Raise your hand. I was. How many people speak more than one language? Dr. Morgan does. You know, how many people are short? That's not me. How many people are tall? How many people are introverts? How many people are extroverts? There is so much more, and that's what we want to do. But we have to be willing to be vulnerable to say, there's a lot of things that I don't know. How many of you have had a course on unconscious bias, implicit bias, macroaggression? Do you even know what that is? And so that's some of the things that we'll be working on. We paused a lot of that training with COVID, but we have to educate our workforce so that we all can be here. All of us took the cultural sensitivity module that was released back in April. You saw it again in our annual review, but we need to have more training. And then we have our diversity councils. Diversity councils, they are volunteer employees at all levels of the organization. If you are not part of a diversity council, I encourage you to join. It's not just for ethnically diverse people, it's not just for women, it's for anybody who wants to make D&I part of their DNA. And these councils are working to understand what's going on in that entity and push the needle forward. And then we have our community health initiatives. And of course, that's what we're going to go into a little bit more with Dr. Morgan, but even some other things that we're doing, like Piedmont working in the Leadership D&I Forum at the National Institute. I serve as the chair of that forum so that we can talk to healthcare organizations similar to us who do not compete with Piedmont. 4 things we're working on. Next slide for FY22, making D&I part of our DNA. But we had a couple of accomplishments here, and this is something that I'm really proud of. So we talked about our increased minority representation in leadership. There is the slate. There were 17 director and above hires in FY21. 2 were ethnically diverse. 11.8% of those were ethnically diverse in FY21. So you can see by looking at this pie chart how when I came in, the numbers were not moving. Again, is the goal just to increase women and ethnically diverse people in leadership? No, it's to get the best person there. But there are talented people right here in Piedmont, and we're also bringing in talented people who should be able to bring the best that they can offer to Piedmont. Again, you move what you measure. Anybody who ever tried to lose weight, got to get on that scale to determine if you are making progress. Speaking to the choir, I do that every day. Next slide, next slide. The more I weigh, the more I see we're making progress. This is something I'm particularly proud of, though. When you look at the ethnically diverse head count, look where that arrow is. When I started here in FY19, you can see there has been a 68% increase in the number of ethnically diverse people. In the state of Georgia, it is a melting pot. It's a melting pot for Asian Pacifics. It's a melting pot for Hispanics. The Georgia Chamber says by 2050, the state of Georgia will have more people who are currently in the minority in the majority. So therefore, even our organization should represent the people that we care for in and around the Atlanta area and the state of Georgia. And we've been able to see an increase there because we have been intentional about it. Next slide. I want to give Anita a shout out for working on that. So we talk about this increased access to education and training. I don't know how many of you are aware that we have a program that we piloted called the Emerging Leaders Program. And this was actually the vision of Sid from the board. One day I was presenting to the PLT and I was telling him that we have to be more intentional of understanding the skills that people bring to our organization. There's some people who join Piedmont, they say, hey, I'm working in this job. I don't want to be promoted. I'm fine. There are other people who are saying, I did other things in different organizations and I want to move up. So Sid says, hey, when I was working at a corporation, Profit World, I started this program where you get people who are not in leadership positions nominated by their managers to sit down with someone like me, speaking of Sid, and I talked to them about the gaps. I talked to them about the importance of business acumen, of executive presence. So we started a pilot in Atlanta, Piedmont, Atlanta. We had 10 people go through the first cohort right before COVID hit. And now we want to start rolling this program out in not only the other hospital entities, but even throughout the system office and rev cycle. And I'm pleased to report in that first cohort, we had 10 non-management people join. 3 people have since been promoted to manager because they got the training, they got the exposure, the mentoring, the coaching that they needed to move forward. We even have in our diversity council, one thing that was really important to me is that the chairs and the co-chairs for the diversity council were people who were not currently in leadership, to give them that visibility to move up if that was the desire. And not totally across the board. We do have some directors, managers, and EDs who are part of the council, who are on the leadership team. But to date, we have had 4 diversity council people promoted, people who are not in leadership. So I'm happy about that. And then we're going to continue on with the next slide to talk about our observances, because again, I believe you have to educate and you have to celebrate. Everything is not a celebration. We will make sure. Here's a great question. Have you visited the Diversity and Inclusion Black History page on the Village? Yes or no? This is something that is really important, and I think it's really important. I've had people say to me, I didn't even know that we had a D&I page on the Village. This month, in the month of September, we are celebrating Black History. My first year here, we took a different approach, and I actually interviewed 4 people who were making history, 2 of the African American board members. I interviewed Dr. William Watkins, and I interviewed Jeff Brown. Then last year, we interviewed some people who had long-standing tenure. This year, we decided to actually go internally, and we identified 5 individuals who we believe are making history each and every day right here at Piedmont. Who, do you ask? Continue to do the poll and let me show you. Look on the next slide. These are people that we talked to some leaders about, and we looked to see what they were doing. Before we get there, just talk a little bit about some of the inclusion observances so far. You may notice, hey, some of these are blue, some of these are orange. We started our observance based on where the brand of the organization was. We always want to be in line with that, and you see it change. Each year, we try to add something different to celebrate and to educate on. So you can see, I mean, how many of us normally around December like to say, hey, you're coming to my Christmas party, we're going to have a Christmas luncheon. Our organization has changed. So we want to make sure that we're mindful of that. So we celebrate Hanukkah, we celebrate Christmas, we celebrate Kwanzaa. And then we started the year off with used to be called Chinese New Year. Now it's called Lunar New Year. And we actually interviewed 2 HR employees, and they are on the Village to tell us why this is so significant to us. Next slide. Hopefully you all were able to participate in some type of way in the MLK celebration. But here we are on Black History Month. Representation, identity, and diversity. If by chance you have gone to the page, you may have seen this. Hopefully you've seen some of these banners. We have some of these displayed not only in the system office, but throughout all of the entities in the hospital. We purchased some more and had them shipped last week so that people could see that there are African Americans who have made great history, particularly around medicine and healthcare, including our own Dr. Jayne Morgan, and she's going to talk more about that, but that's what we have. But now I'm excited on the next slide. I want to introduce you to some leaders right here who are making Black history. If you don't know these people, I encourage you to send them an email. Go to the page and learn. Darryl Fagan's more than 30 years. He's part of Piedmont Columbus. He is the director of EVS, but his leader said he's a servant leader. Darryl has come up with efficient ways to do cleaning, and he has spoken all across the country with some of the things that he's put in place at Piedmont Columbus that they're now starting to use in other places. Dr. Cynthia Finney is the current NAACP president in Newnan. She was the first African American woman hired as a physical therapist at Piedmont. She also stood tall when the KKK had their march in Noonan, and there was some possibility that there would have been some issues a few years ago. There was not, but then the very next year, she organized an MLK parade to also show where that city of Noonan was in supporting and honoring the life of Dr. Martin Luther King. Charmaine Helton, she works for me on my team. She's our HR programs manager, but she's much more than that. She is a survivor and a thriver. She attended Spelman College, same college, historically Black college and university where Dr. Jayne Morgan went to school. But she was a victim of domestic abuse. But her story took her on the national stage, where she's spoken in Washington, D.C. with Mary Kay and explained her story of why sometimes we don't understand that people who sit near us, go in the grocery store, sit in church, are battling things. Um, but through this, she had a long history at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and there is a kitchen in Decatur at a shelter where she lived that is named after her. Great person to know. How many of you know that less than 2% of the people in real estate are African Americans? My friend Jack Tillman hired one of those, and that is Keisha in the Black. And so she is breaking barriers in this field of real estate as an African American woman. But not only is she making history there, she loved Piedmont so much that she told her sister about the company, and now her sister also works here. Dr. Lacy Knight, I like to call him a visionary around technology. He is a doctor, but he is also a visionary, the chief informatics officer of how we can take technology to help drive decisions. I partnered on the cultural sensitivity module with him because one of the things he observed in the city of Atlanta and throughout the state of Georgia, we're starting to see an increased number of LGBTQ plus people and transgender. They were going into our clinics, going into our hospital. Sometimes people would not know what to call them. That would be a great example. If I'm Joanne, if I was born John, but then I decided to become a woman and I'm Joanne, well, I still may want to be called Joanne. And we had people saying, well, that's John. We have to be able to treat people and identify with them the way they want to be identified. So, Dr. Lacy Knight, again, go to the DNI page on the Village and read their stories. We could have picked 500 people, including our own Dr. Jayne Morgan, who has a powerful story. But we picked these, and I ask you to celebrate them, not only through Black History Month, but today and always. Next slide.
We
So
are
not only
very fortunate to be able to work with Keisha on a very regular basis in finance. So
really
I've got to know her
awesome.
quite a bit.
She is a powerhouse. She's a powerhouse. And now, drum roll, please. Again, continuing our focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I believe the more you know, the more you grow. The more you and I lean in, the more you find out that Joanne and Anita have more in common than we actually realize. So one of the things that Kevin Brown said to me during MLK, during the celebration, we were not able to do a lot of the things that we had planned to do because the numbers were high. And he said, we've got to do more. And that's why some of you received a meal from your leaders, because we know that Dr. King was a servant leader. Well, when Kevin Brown joined Piedmont, one of the first places he went when he came down 7 years ago when he started was the National Center for Civil and Human Rights on Ivan Allen Boulevard. He said he took his sister, and the visit through this museum changed his life. And I want to go ahead and caveat this right now. This is not a place just to learn about African American history. I had a site visit there as we planned this Piedmont Day. And I'm going to tell you right now, I was moved beyond belief. How many people on this call know that when we had the March on Washington with Dr. King, it was the first national forum for the LGBTQ plus. It was not just people marching for civil rights for African Americans. It was not. That was the first public national coming together of people who are also fighting for the rights of the LGBTQ plus community. When I went through the museum and I saw how many people who were Caucasian, who were jailed, who were beaten alongside people That's why it takes allies. It takes people that look like me and people who don't look like me talking together, walking together, dreaming together. And that is what we experience. And we're all going to be able to experience it as a Piedmont team and family, because on Saturday, March 19th, it's going to be Piedmont Day at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. So you and your family, as many people as you want, can go in and be free that day. All you have to do is bring your Piedmont badge. We're really making it an event. Got a lot of surprises there, some step and repeat opportunities to mix and mingle. Kevin Brown will be there. He's asked for everybody in the PLT to be there. It's from 9 to 4. We're working on a know before you go flyer that will come out. But some of you can say, hey, I heard it before. It was even announced to people. It is for everyone. We encourage you to come experience this so that we can continue to make D&I part of our DNA. Next slide. Again, so we talk about, some of our accomplishments. So I told you part of our focus area too is also, what are we doing in the community? I said this to the board, and I say this oftentimes. I do not believe a company can never be separate from the community, from the city, or the country from which it resides. That we are Piedmont Healthcare, whether we're system office employees, whether we're in quality, whether we're in HR, whether we're an entity, and we are patient centered. But to make our patients whole, we have to have whole employees, and we have to know what's going on in our community. We know that COVID only highlighted the many, many health disparities that have always been there. And so through COVID, we also saw the creation of a new role, which was the COVID ED of the COVID Medical Task Force, which was our own Dr. Jayne Morgan. So we had an opportunity, and she brought me and my team in on the Sunday of Memorial Day, working in the hot sun. We were able to go to Ebenezer Baptist Church, and then we went back in June when Vice President Kamala Harris came to town, and you can see some of the pictures. I told the board, I said, hey, do you see Joanne? I'm hanging out with Dr. Michelle Lewinsky. We're like best friends now at that event. We're not best friends. Maybe Dr. Morgan and she are best friends. But that is some of the work that we were able to do. We want to do more of that, not only with our councils, but also supporting Dr. Morgan as she continues to take the lead on looking at where we are as an organization, not only with our vaccines, but with health equity as well. A couple more pictures. Next slide, Anita. So that's what we want to do. And I'm so pleased to ask the question, as I always do. I don't know if you have another poll question before I move to Dr. Morgan, is where are you in inclusion? Where are you in inclusion? Have you seen Dr. Jayne Morgan on television during the past 2 years? Now, if you say no, I'm going to want to know if you have cable or Wi-Fi. We're going to have a conversation, have some coffee. But I will say for me, when I started at Piedmont 2.5 years ago, probably within my first couple of months, Dr. Morgan, she reached out to me and we had lunch together. And it seemed like we were just meeting because we were two team members here at Piedmont. We're also two African American women. I found out more that she was actually in the same graduating class from Spelman University with Spelman College with my sister. And they are in the same sorority, and the list could go on and on. But I'm very proud to say that I know and work closely with and celebrate the work of Dr. Jayne Morgan. That she's more than experienced, she's more than educated, and she's done more execution than most people that I know of. And at this point, I will take the conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion for Black history to none other than Dr. Jayne Morgan. And she's a local celebrity now. I like that. Dr. Morgan, take it away. Can we give her a round of applause? I can't hear anything, but I'm clapping.
Oh my goodness, Joanne, thank you. That was amazing. I was sitting there saying, "Oh, that is." So I'm going to share my screen, and let's see if these slides will come up. All right. Can you all
Just
see
to remind
those?
everyone that if they have any questions for either Joanne or Dr. Morgan, you can put that into the Q&A or chat functionality of the WebEx, and I will be monitoring that and ask those questions.
All right. Are you all able to see these slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So let's see if I can go into just a full screen view.
I love how our slides blend. I'll tell Adrian, the project manager.
Yeah. All right. Here we go. All right. So this, I appreciate being invited, Black History Month and vaccines. And I am going to talk today really about sort of the medical history of vaccines and where we are and how is that relevant to Black history. And so we'll do that for the next part of this half hour, maybe a little less. Before we start, I definitely wanted to let you all know, I do something called Stairwell Chronicles. I sit on the stairs. I give information about COVID, the COVID vaccine, 60 seconds or less. I'm going to take Stairwell Chronicles live on Monday, a 30-minute webinar. So if anybody is interested, feel free to register. I'm going to talk about the intersection of COVID-19 and heart health. And what does that mean? And if you need the link, you can obviously reach out to me, but you can also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, and find the link there, or absolutely just reach out to me. You've got my Piedmont email, and I can send you the link. So I thought I would start, and you may or may not have heard, if you've heard me give earlier talks during this pandemic about Dr. James Marion Sims. I think he's an important figure that people don't know about. We hear about the Tuskegee experiment, we hear about Henrietta Lacks, but we really don't hear a lot about Dr. James Marion Sims. Physicians know about him because when we went to medical school, we learned and we were taught that he was the father of gynecology. And so this was a fairly famous, prominent figure during our medical school rotations. And what he did was he devised a procedure that corrects tears in women's vaginas that come after childbirth, a baby that may be too large, that gives you an unwanted connection to either your rectum or other parts of your body, and it causes a lot of infections, it causes a lot of pain. He created a procedure that corrected that and really restored health to a lot of women and their quality of life. So he was lauded as the father of gynecology. We learned about him in medical school. But we learned later about the story behind the scenes where he actually perfected this procedure by having Black women come in who had no advocacy, had no food, had no place to go. And he performed these procedures and really, I mean, surgeries on these women without the advent of anesthesia, and also not knowing what he was doing. He was practicing, he was learning. One woman in particular underwent 300 or 400 of these procedures before she expired with no anesthesia, writhing, screaming, begging for mercy. None was coming. And then when he finally perfected this procedure and sacrificed all of these women, it was rolled out to white women, and they underwent the procedure comfortably in hospitals under anesthesia and had a great restoration of their quality of life. But the story behind the scenes was that many Black women had been sacrificed for this advancement in science and medicine. I'm showing this picture because he had a bronze statue erected. There was a bronze statue erected in New York for years. And we lobbied, and I was a part of that lobby to get this statue removed about 10 or 11 years ago. And this is a picture of them finally removing this statue from the park. And I don't know where it is, but he was finally removed from the park. And hopefully he's been removed from medical books as well as the father of gynecology. And so when we talk about vaccines, there's been a lot of hesitancy in the African-American population to accept these vaccines. I've told you just one story, but there's not really a warm and fuzzy relationship between the African-American population and research, and the African-American population and clinical trials, and the African-American population and the medical centers, these big medical centers. that we all work for and we're familiar with, but not a great relationship because there's not a trust there with regard to what the outcomes are going to be. So one of the interesting things as I studied these vaccines for the last couple of years is the tracking of vaccines throughout the centuries, all the way to these messenger RNA vaccines, specifically Moderna, and how Black people had a hand in the development of these vaccines. And so even though as a group we've had a lot of hesitancy, we actually have a lot of responsibility and should laud ourselves for how vaccines even came to be in the United States and how they continued their development. So this is a historical documentation really of marginalization, cruelty, slavery, discrimination, forbearance, and intelligence. So it all really began with a kidnapping. In 1706, I guess I'll start with that. In 1706, there was a young teenage boy who became ensnared in the capture and the roundup of other Africans by white Americans who had come to Africa for this sole purpose. Along with others that were either captured or betrayed, he was forever separated from his home to never return. He was transported back to the colonies that at that time were rapidly building an economy based on free and forced servitude. We never will know his given name. He arrived with all the other Africans, forever stripped of any piece of identity, no way to recapture it, lost, broken, chained, treated less than any animal, with an entire life of hopelessness ahead. He survived. He survived this treacherous, inhumane conditions of the cargo ships that were steeped in feces and urine and disease. They were chained to these benches. They were unable to move. They could only relieve themselves where they sat for months. They were humiliated, degraded, filthy, confused, often sick. This young boy is how he came to the United States. When he arrived, he was actually bought by a church. A church congregation was looking for a present for their Puritan minister, and they found the present in this young boy who had been kidnapped. That minister is Reverend Cotton Mather. If you know this name, you may remember him because he was also very significant in the witch hunts, back in the Salem witch hunts. This is the same Reverend Cotton Mather. And so after they purchased this boy and presented him to Cotton Mather, he was very, very pleased, and he gave him the name of Onesimus, which literally means useful, the useful one. I put his date here at 1706 because it's really unclear. Documents weren't made of him, but 1706 is when he was presented to the Reverend, and there's no documentation, obviously, as well, of when he died. But what was interesting about him is that in 1721, Boston experienced its worst smallpox outbreak ever. And this outbreak lasted for about 1.5 years. There were thousands of people who died. A healthy person were very rare, and they had flags flying over their homes to mark who was healthy and who was sick. And so Onesimus, the useful one, approaches his owner and explains to him the African practice of taking juice from an infected person's pustules and placing it into an area of broken skin on a healthy person. The healthy person then becomes sick, but recovers and is protected for the remainder of their lives. Reverend Mather actually writes, he told me that he had undergone this operation, which had given him something of the smallpox and would forever preserve him from it. Mather tried to convince other whites to do this procedure, but no one was willing to accept, mostly that it was coming from a Black person. And in fact, Mather was excoriated and annihilated for bringing something to doctors that astonished and insulted them that it came from a Black person. But as we know, similar to COVID, the smallpox infection continued to rage, killed more than 14% of the population. It was only towards the end of the pandemic, when the Bostonians were really in a desperate state, that they submitted to this procedure. And after that, instead of a 14% death rate, they only had 1 in 48 dying, a huge success. This procedure really was known at that time as variolation. It laid the foundation for the eventual discovery and development of the smallpox vaccination, which was derived from cowpox in 1796. What's significant about that is, and here's an example of really what smallpox looks like. A devastating disease, easy to identify. And here are 2 boys, one suffering with it and one suffering without it. And truly, you suffered with smallpox. Smallpox would eventually go on to become the only disease in the world by 1980 to have been completely eradicated worldwide. The only disease, there's not a single word about Onesimus in the history books. When we look at smallpox, when we look at the eradication, this person does not exist. He has all been erased, all but erased from this recorded medical triumph. He was relegated to the shadows behind the whiteness of Mather. This is a slave with only one name and no rights, but he started all of this. And so it's something that we have to think about when we think about, what is our concern with vaccines? Here's how vaccines actually began in this country. If we look at 1893, Frederick McKinley Jones, born in Cincinnati, Ohio, he would grow with a difficult childhood, actually was orphaned by the time he was a child, was brought up by priests, and then later ran away from the priests. And was on his own as a teenager, had very little education, was never formally educated nor cared for in his entire life. But he would grow up to have over 60 inventions. And one of the more significant inventions that I'm going to talk about with regard to vaccines is an invention of a patent in 1940 that became known as the U.S. Thermal Control Company, later known as Thermo King, which began to be critical during World War II for transporting blood. Why was it critical? What this was refrigerated transportation. Prior to this patent, we had no way of shipping things in refrigerated containers. So when we look at Mr. McKinley Jones, the entire, and I use the word entire, transportation refrigeration industry was started with this Black man, including containerisms, where he moved from refrigerated trucks to building refrigerated containers that could then be transported from ships to trucks to planes. And they were used in World War II to transport food, perishables, and blood to our soldiers on the front line. That came from him. But what else did we use them for? Our messenger RNA COVID vaccines have cold chain requirements. They all require cold storage, and all were shipped in refrigerated containers bearing the 1940 patent of Frederick McKinley Jones. Interestingly, he died in 1961. He had a partner who brought him in. His name is Joseph Numero, who basically utilized him as an engineer and gave him no ownership, even though he had the patent. Soon after he died in 1961, Joseph Numero, after his death, posthumously sold Thermo King to Westinghouse for $35 million. And Mr. McKinley Jones never received any of it and was not alive to even contest it. Thermo King then subsequently sold for $2.56 billion to Ingersoll in 1997. It is now owned by Trane. The entire refrigeration industry began with this man with minimal education. And that is how our vaccines have been transported around the entire world. And then finally, I bring to you Dr. Khasmekia Corbett. She is still alive. She was born in 1986 in Hurdle Mills, North Carolina. She's responsible, this doctor, for leading the development of the National Institutes of Health's COVID vaccine program from 2014 to 2020, which led to the direct development of the COVID vaccine that was deployed by Moderna. This is where Moderna's vaccine came from. She's credited at that time, it was called messenger RNA 1273. That was the Moderna compound. And that has been the most used SARS-CoV-2 virus vaccine responsible for COVID-19. And she is the co-scientific lead. These are people in Black America, in Africa, in African-American literature, in American literature that we don't hear about. We can draw direct lines, not dotted lines, to how vaccines came to the United States, all the way to how the COVID vaccines reach you today, and who is inventing them, who's responsible for them, and how we even transport them.
Have you ever met her, Dr. Morgan?
I'm sorry, what?
Have you ever had the opportunity to meet her?
No, I've never met her.
Well, if I ever met her in person, I would give her a huge hug because she saved so many lives the last 2 years.
Interestingly, indeed she has. And interestingly, Onesimus, the youthful one whose name we will never know, who's in an unmarked grave with no dates of birth or death, who had no rights as a slave, is also not even mentioned in history, even in relation to the smallpox vaccine. And this is how it was first introduced into the United States. Mr. McKinley Jones, also poor education, but a brilliant engineer, self-taught, had more than 60 patents, including in the, if you were to look him up, including in the film industry of how to develop film. And he almost received no money for it because he didn't understand that he had to patent these inventions. And there were others who took advantage of that and then took credit for all of his work, and of course, then took his money. And so it took him until 1940 to even understand that he needed to get a patent when he developed this refrigerated truck. And even so, he received nothing, and his partner waited. Well, I won't say waited till he died, but the company was sold after he died, and nothing went to he or his family. So I wanted to walk you through that because, you know, vaccines have another history that you don't hear about and that people don't talk about. And that's because we don't know about it. We don't teach it in schools. It's ignored. And so it requires, even for me, to dig and research and have some interest in it to understand what it really means. And if we talk about being hesitant to receive vaccines, really, we're not understanding our history of where vaccines came from, how they came to be, how they're being developed, who's developing them, how we're even shipping them. And that's because this history isn't taught in our schools either. So I appreciate you all letting me come today. Again, I will have a Stairwell Chronicles live on Monday talking about COVID-19 and heart health. Feel free to register. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much for participating. We really appreciate it. So if I could just ask a question about your whirlwind last couple of years, as I was talking with your assistant trying to, you know, organize this event, I asked her if she helped some with your media, you know, scheduling and things like that, and she said that she did. How many different programs have you been on? It doesn't matter if it's 6 o'clock on a Saturday morning, I turn on the TV and there you are, or if it's 9 o'clock at night, you could be there at that point too.
Yeah, actually, I don't know. When we did sort of a community service survey for 2021, and I think there were more than, 300 events on there if you take everything into consideration, podcast appearances, all of my Stairwell Chronicles, CNN, local news, keynote speaking engagements, research papers. I've had several publications this year. So if you take all of that into consideration, it's probably, I don't actually remember. I think it was over 300 for the year. Vaccine clinics. So it's been an incredible pace, right, to keep up with. I always say if you want to go into science, you have to be prepared to be an eternal student. And I think these last 2 years have demonstrated that. If you're not prepared to be an eternal student, then science medicine is not for you. It's ever changing, it's ever evolving. You've got to be willing to learn and interested in learning. It can't be a burden. And I think these last 2 years have shown that we had to stay on top of the information to be able to treat our patients to the absolute top care. And that's just not at Piedmont, that was everywhere around the world. Doctors really dug in, as well as other healthcare professionals, but specifically the research scientists and physicians managing and maintaining and having ultimate responsibility for those patients.
So you've had a lot of national coverage with some of the programs that you've been on. I'm sure it's been gratifying for people, speaking of the hesitancy that you talked about, to give you feedback that said, I would not have gotten this vaccine if I had not heard you on television, or had you not come, to Ebenezer for this clinic today, and that type of stuff.
Yeah, I would say some of the most gratifying things that have happened to me in 2021 haven't been any of the big things. It's been the little messages that I get, direct messages or instant messages on social media, where somebody just says to me something like, I've just been following your Stairwell Chronicles for 2 or 3 months, and today I got the vaccine, and it's just been because I've been listening to you for a while. Or every time you post something, I send it to my mother, and today my mom finally got the vaccine, and I just want to thank you. It's like those singular, just one person was impacted. It's not, the big CNN talks, the keynote addresses, that one person who says, I did it, or my cousin did it. And it really has been sort of hand-to-hand combat. And those personal stories that have been able to impact one person really were the most significant for me.
That's wonderful to hear. Is saving lives one person at a time, really, is what you've done for the last 2 years. And hopefully it makes all of your efforts worth it, because I know a lot of production and editing and all of that goes into the videos that you make and that type of thing. So we appreciate it, and we're very proud of you and proud that you're part of Piedmont.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting us today.
I have one last question for Joanne, and just to see if you had any, I know it's just, late breaking news, but from a diversity and inclusion perspective, the new Supreme Court Justice announcement that came out today, if you wanted to say anything about that.
Thank you, Anita. That's really timely. And I also thank you for including me. And I can tell you that there's some people on this call have already asked me if this is being recorded because they want to share it. And my comment is that when President Biden said during the campaign trail that if he won, he would support and nominate an African-American woman to be on the Supreme Court. I was pleased with that. But I think my pleasure may be different than pleasure of some other people, because I think sometimes when things like this happen, it's taken out of context, whether it is the nomination for a Supreme Court, or whether or not we should boycott the Oscars because we don't have enough diverse people who have won awards. And I'll say this, she's the first, but she's more than qualified. In my opinion, she and others, other brown and Black people, other females, should have been nominated a long time ago. And so I would ask us, as people who are trying to lean into diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think it was the late Dr. John Lewis, and even Dr. King, Dr. Lewis said, it is our moral obligation when we see something to say something. Dr. King said it's always the right time to do the right thing. I think we can stop the conversation that is starting to bubble up to say, well, why is he saying a Black woman? It could be anyone. It's past time. She's ready. The 3, there are probably a dozen more who could have made it. I grew up in the age of affirmative action, and I know that some people look at that. I do not consider this to be affirmative action. I consider it to be time, because as the mother of a 28-year-old African-American son and a 15-year-old, it is my hope and desire that the conversations we're having today about the first become the way it is because we're already there. So I hope it will not be a process that will be dragged out, and that we can continue to look at people for what they bring to the table and not so much from what you see. Because if you stop at what you see, you're going to miss out on the best part of me, and me is each and every one of us.
Well, thank you so much for that response. I really appreciate it. And we are thrilled, again, to have you come today. And I have recorded the session. And since people are asking for it, I will send it out to the link to everyone on our distribution list so that they can share it, because I think that you've presented a lot of important information. You've cheerleaded a lot of Piedmont employees, and it's something that, is very worthy of being shared. So I'm going to send that out to everyone. And I hope you both have a wonderful weekend and be safe.
Thanks
so
everyone.
much.
Be safe.
Yeah.
Happy Friday. Thank you so much.
Include me on your distribution list. I'd love to get a copy. It was great.
Oh, yes.
I certainly will. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.